Hello everybody, I'm 𝗟𝗿𝗀𝗲𝗁, based in the Smith School here in Oxford, where I do climate economics and policy. So I'll be hosting you today, but the star attraction is Olivier Mahul here, who will be talking to us about carbon markets, or specifically from carbon funds to carbon markets. It's a hybrid event, so there's some of us here in the room, but there's a much larger number of people online, so welcome to the people online as well. Olivier is Global Manager of Climate Finance Mobilization in the Climate Change Department in the World Bank, and he's just confirmed the department is still called that, although the motivation is sort of being refined. Yeah, we're going to talk about the carbon markets probably from a World Bank perspective, but also from a general perspective. Olivier will talk about half an hour, thereabouts.
Wonderful.
So, Olivier, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. And it's a busy week between, of course, exams, Henderson in Oxford, but also the London Climate Week. So I'm glad you can come in person. So, as Sam said, I'm Olivier Mahul. I used to be the global manager in charge of risk finance at the bank, and last year moved to this kind of new role of climate finance mobilization. And I say that because you will see that I will also try to bring this kind of risk finance dimension toward climate finance. So what I like to present to you today is more or less my understanding and my, I would say, personal opinion about how these carbon funds have been set up in the bank and how they've been evolving over the last 2 decades, moving toward carbon markets. And it's even more relevant when we see, of course, the status of the carbon markets. So let me start explaining why the World Bank is working on carbon markets. So if I were to be a bit provocative, I would say the World Bank is not a climate bank, it's a development bank. But because climate has a big impact on our clients, including the beneficiaries, those living in the kind of poor areas, we need to tackle this climate agenda. On the adaptation side, for sure, but also on the mitigation side. So as an anecdote, when I meet with Ministers of Finance in developing economies, they see that as an opportunity to mobilize additional funding for development. They know that they have some sort of strategic assets, carbon, and if they can manage to monetize those emission reductions, this is additional funding, debt-free funding they could have for their own development agenda. So it's also a way to see it from a more financial perspective, but okay, it's quite relevant because ultimately, this is what we're dealing with the most countries in developing economies being facing fiscal constraints, if not more fiscal distress. So this kind of climate finance angle is important. And if on top of that, you can, of course, I would say, address some global climate goals, that's even better. So this is where we're trying to reconcile both. And to some extent, carbon markets are a way, to some extent, to transfer capital, if I may say, from one part to another, and also making sure that we can make it efficiently. So my team focused particularly on carbon markets, carbon funds, but more broadly on climate finance, although again, I'm going to focus specifically on climate finance and the mobilization of climate finance. You may have seen this slide before. It's well known, but just also to be the kind of big picture in terms of climate finance, most of the funding is going to developed economies. And when we talk about adaptation finance, as you can see, a small portion, 16%, is going to developing economies, most of that being public finance. And of course, from the private sector side, they're mainly interested by mitigation, including their active role on carbon markets, whether it's the voluntary carbon markets or the other markets. So if I were to summarize in one slide the climate finance network from our perspective, this is the way I would try to portray that. So on the left-hand side, you can see the source of climate finance, starting with the International Public Climate Finance on the big trust funds. You may have heard about the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Fund, all these kind of big funds set up by partners a decade or 2 decades ago to address this climate change agenda. And on the development finance side, most of the development banks, including the World Bank, are playing an active role. And of course, there is also a role for the private sector to some extent, and the public sector, including state-owned enterprises and national EFI. And then in terms of climate finance, the way we're trying to describe that is talking about activity-based finance, the typical grants or finance you're going to do upfront, where you're going to finance specific activities. And more we're focusing also in the bank, beyond carbon, by the way, on outcome-based finance, where we're trying to reward the outcome. Not only to give money to achieve some results, but also to reward some specific outcome. That could be, for example, a reduction in emissions or verified greenhouse gas emissions that can be removed or reduced. And then, as part of that, We have two main instruments we're using in the bank. One is the result-based climate finance, which is where our carbon funds are doing. So to some extent, this is a way to reward and to incentivize our clients to generate large-scale emissions reduction programs. And more now, there is also a role of the carbon markets, whether this is a voluntary carbon markets or the compliance carbon markets. And in fact, what I'm going to try to discuss with you today is this kind of link between the green box on the left, result-based climate finance and carbon markets, and how the two can complement each other, compete sometimes among each other, and also enhance each other. You may be familiar with the carbon crediting, so it's not about pricing today. This is very much about how we can trade emission reductions. And you may be familiar with this kind of process where, to some extent, you start by setting a baseline, you take some actions. Those actions will reduce emissions, and if you can monitor that and measure them, any kind of delta, as you can see here, will be monetized through carbon credits. It goes through a specific process, a lot of conversations about additionality, about the baseline to be properly set up, and also the monitoring and verification. So it's a pretty complex process, very much sector specific, but ultimately, if you manage to do it well, you end up with a new asset, a carbon credit, that can be sold to multiple parties. So if I were to describe carbon credit, I would say, if I were to describe that versus commodity, think of commodity like coffee. The carbon credit will be a kind of flavor of coffee. So it's intangible assets. You cannot really touch it. You cannot really see it. But this is something that can be monetized if, again, well-defined and well-structured. So this is what we're also trying to do with our clients, helping them also set up large-scale emission reduction programs in the energy sector. It could be on the forest sector, agriculture, and again, trying to monetize these strategic assets, as one of our clients mentioned one day. So then, like any commodity or any financial asset, you need a market to exchange, and you will expect the market to be efficient, to be able to meet supply and demand. And the way it's currently structured is around two types of markets, and again, you may be familiar with that, but just for the sake of clarity, one is the compliance carbon markets. And particularly, as you may know, after the COP29, there was a kind of breakthrough toward Article 6, so how to some extent countries or sovereign entities or private entities to some extent can have some bilateral agreements, what we call the ITMO, Internationally Transfer Mitigation Outcomes. So this is to some extent, to meet your national determined goals and the NDC and the contribution. And then you have the voluntary carbon market where, institutions, public and private institutions, may have voluntarily set up their own objectives in terms of, emission reductions. And sometimes they use the carbon market to offset some of their emission reductions if they cannot reduce the emission by themselves. So the key point here is that the carbon market is not meant to replace any kind of effort you may want to do as a firm, as a company, as a state to reduce your emission reduction, but very much to help you, I would say, compensate a small portion because you cannot go beyond your own emission reductions. And some countries may produce more than what they need, and this is where you have this market to exchange this specific commodity called carbon credit. The voluntary carbon market, you may have heard of that. This is also where, as I said, big firms, Amazon of the like, will be quite active. And interestingly, this market, as you can see, has been extremely volatile for multiple reasons. The main reason is trust. Again, when you think of an asset like that, a new asset, which is clearly difficult to define and to measure and then to exchange, it's all about trust. And we have, as you can see here, back to 2021, there was what we call a flight to quality with a big drop in terms of exchanges, following some scandals. I also must say, baselines not properly set up, monitoring system not properly maintained, and ultimately, you were buying hair. You were not buying carbon credits, you were buying something which had no value. So it's also kind of part of this kind of carbon market. But fundamentally, what we've seen recently on the voluntary carbon market, despite the big drop since 2021, is buyers getting more educated and they know exactly what they want. They want high quality, high integrity carbon credits, integrity in terms of environmental integrity and also social integrity. They want to know how the carbon revenues will be used, by whom and how. And also they're willing to some extent to give additional premium if you can have some development co-benefits. It's not only about reducing emission reductions, but if it is linked to some livelihood activities that will ultimately benefit the poor community and the local communities, this is also something that they're willing to price. And what we call the newer vintages, so the most recent carbon credits emitted or issued are also having a slightly higher price. And in fact, yesterday I was at an event organized by Amazon. Amazon is one of the big companies that have a pretty ambitious plan in terms of emission reductions, and they have now set up their own rules on how to buy carbon credits. And again, they give a big, I would say, premium to clarity and transparency in terms of generating this emission reduction, but also the development co-benefits that those programs could do. And for Amazon particularly, they're focusing on what we call green carbon credits, about reforestation and afforestation, particularly in developing economies. But other entities, Microsoft and Google, are also quite active in those markets. Back to the bank now. So the bank has been involved in this agenda for more than 20 years. And so far, we've been working more than 70 plus countries. And the very first carbon credit was launched back in 1999. So some of you may not have been, were born, in fact, when those funds were launched. And they have evolved quite significantly. So a way to describe where we are today is, these are the key funds the bank is managing, as we call carbon fund. One of the most important ones is the one on the left, what we call the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which was set up by public and also some private partners to reduce emissions related to deforestation and degradation of the forests. This was a multi-billion-dollar fund, and it was set up again to provide some financial incentives through offtake guarantees or offtake agreement with the countries to some extent to manage the deforestation and the forest degradation they were facing in their respective countries. When you move, from 2007 to 2013, another fund was established, what we call the Biocarbon Fund. This one was trying to capture greenhouse gas emission reduction, not only related to forests, but the larger, I would say, landscape, agriculture activities, soil management, and climate-smart agricultural practices, anything that to some extent can generate emission reductions. And this is more or less what we call the Green Fund, those related to the green activities, agriculture, land use management, and forests. And then we also what we call the clean funds, those funds that are more focusing on energy efficiency. It's an emission reduction related to energy efficiency, like the Carbon Initiative for Development or the Transformative Carbon Asset Facility. Again, big trust funds, multi-$100 million trust funds to set up the market, if I may say, or to pilot new ways to generate emission reductions in a kind of safe space, because again, the market either was not available or the technology was not, I would say, standard enough, sustainable enough, transparent enough to some extent to attract the private sector. So set as kind of safe space for our clients and our partners to test, to try out, to develop new methodologies, new standards that ultimately then can be picked up by the market and be scaled up through the market. And then as we move again along this kind of arrow, the latest one is what we call Scale. It's again another trust fund trying to consolidate that. And the big difference that now this trust fund is very much trying to link that with the carbon markets, while the previous ones were very much standalone because the market was not existent. And then most of the payments were made through the trust fund, through this kind of carbon funds, without really counting on the private carbon market to pay or to reward for those emission reductions. The new facility Scale on the top is very much designed to act as a facilitator, as a catalyzer between our developed clients, our countries, and the carbon markets, and trying to address some barriers related to the methodology, related to the price volatility or the uncertain demand when it comes to create emission reductions. So again, if you're not familiar with that, this is a way to some extent to briefly summarize what we call the emission reduction program cycle, the way we develop that with our clients. So one is to identify with our clients some projects where you can create emission reductions. Again, it could be in agriculture because you're going to do some land use management, change practices. Take the rice, for example. If you change the way you plant rice or use water in order to produce rice, this may have some positive impact in terms of emission reductions. Or likewise on energy, if you move from using firewood to cook stove, for example, this is also a way to some extent to reduce your emission reduction, but also, by the way, to limit the deforestation. So these are kind of activities you can identify. Then the second point is to ensure integrity. As I said, it's an asset. You need to know what you buy, and you need to have some standards around that. Otherwise, this will be very difficult to monetize, and you don't have trust. So this is the second part, and this is all related to what we call the monitoring and validation systems, or the standards, the registries, everything that will create an asset or commodity out of this kind of emission reduction. Then you try to utilize that. So as a country, you could say, I'm going to use that under my national determined contribution, because, as part of the COP process, as you know, each country every 5 years sets some conditional or unconditional objectives in terms of emission reductions. Or you may want to monetize it, or you may want to sell it to other parties. And the last one, which is particularly important for the bank, is how the money will be used. Since most of the program the bank is supporting are large scale, we call it at the jurisdictional level, could be at the national or subnational level, a lot of actors will be active and will be to some extent contributing to emission reductions. Take a large forest area, national park, you have a lot of local communities living there. They're doing that, as part of their daily activities, and sometimes they're willing to change a bit their activities to generate emission reductions. So you need to make sure that you can identify them and reward them if you get some money out of these carbon credits. And this is what we call a benefit sharing plan. So it's a plan setting up front on how the funding, the carbon revenues, will be used between the governments, local agencies, and ultimately the local communities. So it's a pretty complex process, but again, it's very much about development. So this is also where we have a particular attention here. A few words on the carbon funds I mentioned before. So these are the countries covered right now. So in the kind of light green, this is those dealing with this forest carbon fund, so focusing on forests, particularly to protect large forest areas, large national parks, for example. And the dark green are countries where we're having this kind of landscape approach, agricultural approach, which is a larger way to try to capture emission reductions. And likewise, I did mention before one of these trust funds, 𝗙𝗿, dealing with cook stove, dealing with rural electrification. And again, it's an interesting carbon fund because here we're trying to develop some projects in a pretty, I would say, difficult areas, low-income countries, countries exposed to some conflict sometimes, and fragile countries. And still, you can still have programs which are working well, and even including the private sector. So it's not the most natural place to some extent to develop those programs, but this is exactly where the World Bank is coming, because the private sector may be a bit more hesitant to engage in countries like Rwanda or in countries like Madagascar. But this is exactly the development benefit of the World Bank here. So if I were to summarize also the kind of timing dimension, a lot is about technical assistance. A lot is about to explain to our partners how you're gonna identify, generate, and monetize those carbon credits. And then, as you get ready from a market perspective, you're gonna progressively replace what we call result-based climate finance, this kind of grant funding given by our donor partners to monetize that, and you're gonna accompany to some extent those countries toward carbon markets. But of course, the transition is not overnight. It takes some time, and sometimes you end up with a kind of blended system where you guarantee some purchase of carbon credit through offtake agreement, and then you accompany those countries to sell ultimately those carbon credits to the carbon markets. And ultimately, for larger countries, more evolved countries, they should be able to go directly to the carbon market, while some less advanced economies will rely more on what we call result-based climate finance, meaning donor funding to be rewarded for their efforts in emission reductions. So fundamentally, 3 points also I like to highlight when we talk about carbon, and particularly this kind of public-private carbon partnership, I would say, because of course it's a fine balance to involve the private sector, but also to make sure that the public sector plays a role, to make sure that the market can evolve, like any other markets, I would say, like any other commodity. One is about infrastructure. So the bank is doing a lot of investment, helping our clients to build the right infrastructure when it comes to identifying projects and making sure that you can again monitor and monetize those benefits. To the policy framework. The big challenge most of the private sector partners, project developers are facing is the lack of stable policy framework, simply because it's a new market and most of the countries don't exactly know how to deal with that. So having a kind of stable policy and regulatory framework is quite important. One example, under Article 6, for someone familiar with that, this is under the COP agenda, you are allowed to sell your carbon credits to a third party in the compliance market, as I mentioned before. But in order to do so, the government needs to issue what we call a letter of authorization. It's a legal document. So without going into details, this letter of authorization in some cases may be revoked for multiple reasons. So if as a private buyer, I buy an asset, which I'd say is values $50 because of this letter of authorization, and if tomorrow, for whatever reason, this authorization is revoked by the country or by the court, then of course my asset will lose value. So how can you make sure that you create this kind of regulatory framework to address that? And then of course, private capital mobilization, because you need to have some investment upfront, and you need also to be able to sell those credits and to protect those credits against some risks, as I mentioned, legal risk, operational risk, or market risks because of price volatility. So this is to some extent, like for any other market, you need to find the right balance between what is the role of the public sector, what is the role of the private sector, and making sure that you find the right, I would say, balance among those respective roles and responsibilities. So I won't go into too much details. So crediting standards, this is one example where you can see, the blue line showing where the forest carbon partnership is dealing with, which is very much, the forest area, while the other green fund I mentioned is much larger area covering the agricultural sector, and it's all about large scale jurisdictional accounting. The private sector is very good in doing some focused projects. The bank has an advantage in terms of having this kind of policy dialogue, and so we can aim for larger or large scale accounting for carbon credits. And I can go through other standards. There are standards being developed. We can also now rely on 𝗟ซี้. This is a kind of group of international airline companies who have set up this kind of program also to offset their emission reductions for international flights. And again, this is a kind of new source of a market that some of our clients can also access, again, under certain rules, under certain standards. So we need to make sure that they can be prepared, and they offer the assets that this 𝗟ซี้association is willing to buy, which may be different from other groups. So again, the standardization of the market is something that will take some time, but will be critical to make also the market liquid and not ending up with too many standards and the market being then illiquid. One thing also which is quite innovative, when I mentioned to you that one of the role of those carbon funds is very much to act as a kind of safe space where you can innovate. One type of innovation we've been doing over the last few years is what we call policy crediting. So we're trying to reward countries willing to make some policy reforms that they will not do otherwise and that will benefit to some extent the planet. A good example is the work we've done in Uzbekistan, where there was an energy subsidy reform that was planned to be developed for many years, but no political buy-in, no financial incentive. So one of our trust funds came and gave some additional financial incentive for the government to pass this policy reform in terms of energy subsidy reform. To some extent, this is to redirect energy subsidies out, from the kind of, I would say, fuel and other types of not so clean energy. And by doing so, you expect to have a reduction in energy consumption, at least a shift in your energy mix, moving around out of coal. Then you have some emission reductions being created, and then you end up having a kind of payment being made. And again, without into details, to some extent, we've been able to provide additional funding to the Ministry of Finance through this kind of policy reform. So this is a way where the policy dialogue, combined with some financial reward and financial incentives, help the government take this kind of decision, which was not an easy one, because of course, you had to pass and to some extent to repurpose the energy subsidies. So this is very much this kind of policy approach, which can have some major benefits, but it's a bit more complicated to put in place because, again, it's a policy dialogue. So again, how can you make sure that over time, those policies will stay in place and the next government will not change to some extent the policy. So again, part of our policy toolkit to some extent to have this kind of policy reforms in place. Standard crediting framework, I won't go into too much details. As I said, for a country to be able to generate and then monetize carbon credits, you need to have the kind of proper institutional setup in place. And one of our trust funds is also helping those countries, one of the least advanced countries, to have in place this kind of institutional setup, who is going to approve a standard, who is not going to approve a standard, who is going to approve a methodology, who is going to be responsible for the monitoring from an institutional perspective. This is also something we're doing, and also we're doing some pilot transactions. So let me spend a few minutes on this one, because ultimately this is where we're trying to link carbon markets and carbon funds. And this is very much what we call the kind of path to monetization. So starting with, as I said, the credit generation, then you have the policy decision. So the client decides what they want to do with their emission reductions. Then you need to register the transaction. Then you need to negotiate with the private sector sometimes, where you sell your credits, and then you need to monetize that through a price. And the way it's been doing so far with our carbon fund are the following. You have an offtake agreement. So when we engage with the clients, they know that we're going to buy them X carbon credits, or X ton of CO2 by a certain date at a specific price. And usually the way it was set up was clearly an offtake agreement. So it was an obligation for the clients when they generate those carbon credits to sell that to the carbon funds. Some of them went one step beyond and had an offtake agreement with a floor price option. So the contract was, I'm committing now to buy your carbon credits in 5 years' time, because sometimes it does take time to generate those carbon credits. But if, when you have your carbon credits at hand, you find a third party willing to pay more than what I'm going to pay you, you can do that. So it was a kind of option that was given to those clients. And of course, this price option was included because the carbon market was starting to develop, and then there was alternatives, on third parties willing to buy those carbon credits. And then in any case, usually when we have a program with a client, we agree on a specific amount of carbon credits, and if they manage to provide or to generate more than that, excess carbon credits, then they're free to sell it wherever they want, or to use that against their national determined contribution. So again, this is very much a choice of the government to do what they want, but at least with the carbon funds, they know that they will at least recoup the investment they have to make initially to generate those carbon credits. So, and this is one of the last slides. All was done in a sense where, as I said, the carbon funds were very much set up as a kind of safe space where the funds by themselves will buy the carbon credits. And interestingly, if you make a parallel with the risk management, so see it from a risk perspective now, there is an interesting parallel to be done. So a few years ago, some of the countries, to deal with their disaster risks, so it's a different agenda, but you'll see the link. They decided to set up their own, what they call risk pools, in order to mobilize additional capital coming from the private sector to get some insurance against disasters at the sovereign level. So if I were, I would say, Barbados in the Caribbean, if I were to access the insurance market on my own to protect my assets against hurricanes, it would be difficult to do so. I'm too small and I don't know what to do. So they decided to set up this kind of risk pools owned by and managed by the client themselves. So it's a mutual insurance company, if I may say. So you own the insured parties are also the owners of that. So this kind of setup was done in 4 regions in the Caribbean, with the CRIF, in Africa, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, as a way for those countries to join forces and to find a way to approach the private sector in a more structured and with a larger business. And what was very interesting is that by doing so, and I was involved in the establishment of some of those trust funds, it was much more than just buying an insurance policy. It was very much about political ownership. It was very much about standardization, because they had to agree on a product to be sold to the market. It was about innovation. It was about knowledge. And now you can start seeing the link between what I described before on carbon markets and what this kind of vehicles could potentially help our clients better approach the carbon markets. So the question is, what can we learn from this kind of what we call sovereign cat risk pools, which have been active for 15 years for some of them, in terms of the policy dialogue, in terms of the institutional setup and the access to markets, and are there lessons we can draw from that could be relevant for the carbon market? Because as I described right now, in the carbon market, most of the countries go by themselves. We're trying to help them, but there is no a kind of global approach to do so. We have carbon funds, but those carbon funds are set up by donors, by the bank, to help our clients. They're not set up by the client themselves. Could we try to reverse a bit the logic and to say, instead of setting a trust fund financed by donors to help developing countries, can we help developing countries set up their own facility, join forces together, get some funding, agree on some standards, and then be in a more, I would say, powerful position to be able to negotiate with the markets. So if I go as Zambia and talk to Amazon, first of all, Amazon may not even know me, and they don't exactly know what kind of carbon credit I will sell. Now, if I, Zambia, join forces with other African countries and design a standard product, a carbon credit, and then go to Amazon and say, instead of selling you 1 million carbon credits, I'm going to sell you 10 million carbon credits, maybe the negotiation will not be exactly the same. So can we use those kind of facility to some extent to structure the supply of carbon credits, and then using those facilities to approach the market and to find the potential donors? And again, the lessons we learned on the risk pools are quite interesting because it's exactly what we observed. As I said, those risk pools ultimately are also a political vehicle to help countries, address their local issues and then approach the market when it makes sense. So I'll stop here because it's a bit complex here, but what I'm trying to say here is that in order to do so, you can fundamentally have two types of model. One model would be to say on the left-hand side, let's find a way to help countries access technical assistance and offer them some direct access to the markets as a broker. Or you could say, and this is on the right-hand side, why don't also we help those regional facility, multi-country facility, to buy the credits of their members, to structure the credits, and then to sell it to the markets as a portfolio. So what I'm trying to say, there are ways to do that, but fundamentally what we're trying to say is there a need for a kind of intermediary, if I may say, between the countries generating and willing to sell their carbon markets and countries or private sector willing to buy their carbon credits in a more structured way. So again, instead of having this kind of one-on-one dialogue, which may work for large countries, if Brazil, or Mexico go to the carbon market, they have large countries, they will find definitely buyers, while for smaller countries, this may be a bit more challenging because, again, they may not have the critical size to some extent to generate interest to their potential buyers. So there are ways to deal with that. And what we're trying to say here is that some of the lessons we learned from a very different agenda, risk insurance, can to some extent inform some of this kind of structure in terms of ownership, in terms of capital requirement, in terms of transparency, and in terms of control of price. So just to summarize the key messages, and I think I'm more or less on time, 3 things. First of all, so carbon markets do offer opportunities for developing countries. They have opportunities to some extent to mobilize additional finance that can be used for their low carbon and resilient development. This access to carbon market will require particularly some sort of a public-private carbon partnership because you need to set up the right institutions within the country and also clearly articulate the carbon infrastructure, the policy environment, as I said, and also finding some instrument to de-risk some of those investments. And 3, what we're trying to say here is that as the carbon markets evolve, the way the carbon funds that were initially set up may also have to evolve to better facilitate the link between the carbon funds and the carbon market, and making sure that in fact those carbon funds, which primarily were set up to buy the carbon credits, now will act more as a kind of facilitator to leverage the carbon market and then to leverage the private capital that is available on the private sector. So very much acting as a facilitator, while for a long time those carbon funds have been acting as a kind of recipient, if I may say, of the carbon credits, again, as a way also to mobilize, in that case, more public funding than private funding. So here this is very much, and I will finish by that, moving from a kind of public funding type of approach to a more private funding type of approach. And those kind of vehicles like the pools could help to some extent create this kind of shift from public funding to private funding when it comes to carbon finance. And I will stop here. It's been a lot.
Thank you, Olivier.